The sea was quiet now. Not long ago, it had held the echoes of oars and shouts, the spray of salt water against wooden hulls, and the sharp smell of sweat and iron. But all that was gone now. The storm both of wind and war had passed. The fjords, once echoing with the distant cries of battle-hardened men returning, now held only the soft lapping of water against the stones dotted in this gentle lull. This calm that settles like fog across the village shoreline that our story begins, not with violence, not with glory, but with something softer, something slower not to quiet after the storm. The longship, her dragon head carved with care, floated low in the water, her belly heavy with goods, linen sacks tied with knotted cords, baskets of dull metal and unfamiliar coins. Nothing precious, not really just trade. Just tokens of effort exchanged for other people's things, not treasure, not anymore. Not here, in this place where people grew tired of stories with loud endings. Men disembarked with the clumsiness of the weary. Their boots squelched against the muddy shore, not with haste, but with a heavy rhythm one foot, then the other, and then a long sigh. Not one of them spoke. Behind them, the fjord stretched in stillness. The mountain slopes wore thin shawls of morning mist. Pines leaned over the cliffs like old women peering down at their children. It was a picture of peace, but not the painted kind. This peace was earned, felt in tired shoulders and calloused hands. Some of the men bent to untie bundles. Others simply lift up the hill toward the cluster of longhouses, smoke already curling from a few chimneys. You could smell the peat and the slow-burning pine. You could hear the distant bleating of goats, the yawn of a door opening on crooked hinges. It was never dramatic, the return. Not in this village. There were no trumpets, no feasts. There were boots to clean, nets to mend, and dry clothes, waiting to be worn again. There were children whose hair had grown longer in their absence, and wives whose eyes no longer searched the horizon. The first thing many did was sit, right down in the dirt, just sit, and breathed out at the edge of the harbor. An older man crouched by the ship's rudder, brushing barnacles off the wood with a tool fashioned from bone. He didn't say anything, but his movements spoke clearly. Not now. Ship first. Talk later. He wasn't a warrior, not anymore. Maybe once long ago, when his back was straighter, but now his duty was to the hulls and the sails, to the slow care of returning what had left. He'd watched too many return broken. This one hadn't, and that was enough. Dot behind him, the village, stirred awake. You wouldn't call it bustling, Vikings rarely bustled, but there was motion. A woman with a thick braid gathered her cloak around her shoulders and stepped out to check the smokehouse. A small boy trudged after her, rubbing his eyes. From another home, a dog barked once, then thought better of it, and lay back down. The world wasn't rushing anywhere. It was exactly where it needed to be. Somewhere in the folds of morning mist, the long, low call of a cow echoed. And from the forest, a response, a woodcutter's axe, striking rhythmically. The fjord carried these sounds softly, like feathers. Laid upon water dot up the hill, the returning men began to climb, leaving the shore slowly. Goods slung over shoulders, silence between them. It wasn't a sullen quiet, it was a full one, like a cup filled to the brim with the weight of absence. Now spilling gently into a home dot at the top of the pack, a woman stepped out of her doorway, her arms crossed. She didn't run to him, her husband. She only tilted her head and squinted into the light. "You're later than last year," she said. He dropped his bundle onto the ground and let out a long breath. "We had wind against us," he answered. She stepped aside to let him pass. "We saved your share of the goat cheese, but the meat's gone." He nodded. "Fair." And that the longhouse was dim, but warm. A central fire still glowed faintly, and the air was thick with the scent of old smoke and something boiling. Maybe onions or leeks or both. It was hard to tell. After so many weeks at sea, even plain things smelled rich. He sat down on a fur-covered bench near the hearth and looked at the wall. His daughter, now nearly shoulder height, peeked at him from behind a support beam. He smiled but didn't call her. She'd come when she was ready. Children weren't made for reunions. They were made for rhythms. And this was just one more turn of the wheel for her. A father home, a different one gone. A goat born. A neighbor moved away. The year turning slowly, he stretched his legs out and sighed. His boots still smelled like seaweed outside. The ship was being emptied. The youngest boys, too young for raids but old enough for tasks, were hauling sacks toward the communal shed. A few girls helped, mostly because it meant they could walk together and whisper about the returning men who'd grown fatter, who'd returned thinner, who had new scars. No one hurried, not even the wind. The air drifted in gentle gusts down. From the north, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and something more distant, something ancient and cold, like the breath of glaciers beyond the hills. And when the sun climbed just a little higher, thin shadows of ravens passed overhead. They made no noise, only circled once and flew on. Inside the longhouse, a grandmother was humming. She was always humming. No one remembered the time she hadn't been. Her fingers moved gently over a bit of mending, a tunic worn through at the elbow. She wasn't mending for anyone in particular. She just liked to keep her hands moving. Did they bring anything worth keeping? She asked, not looking up. The wife of the returned man, shrugged. Some wool, maybe a comb. The old woman nodded. Her needle passed in and out of the fabric. Wool's good. And then she fell back into her tune. A tune that no one really knew, but everyone somehow recognized. By midday. The work was nearly done. The ship, finally empty, rocked gently at her moorings, her sail folded and tied. Her figurehead turned toward the mountains as if watching them sleep. A pair of seagulls settled on her side, pecking at something crusted near the prow. The harbor smelled of fish, of tar, of wet rope, the kind of smells that never really leave. No matter how far inland you walk, the men had mostly gone now. Back to their homes or to the blacksmith to drop off blades in need of reshaping. Some wandered toward the fields, checking fences, looking at the sky. One stood still for a long time, just watching the water. His name wasn't important. Most names weren't in this kind of story, but his silence was. It was a silence that didn't ask for company. Only time. A few children poked around the remnants left on the shore, bits of broken pottery, half a shoe, a tangle of rope. One found a silver coin and held it up, grinning. What will you buy? Her brother asked. Nothing, she said, and slipped it into her pocket. Good, he replied. I want to borrow it later. And they wandered off, chasing a bird into the grass. The day folded itself into afternoon. The sun cast long shadows down the slope of the hill, painting the grass in gold and gray. The wind picked up a little, and the sails, tied and furled, flapped softly like the slow breathing of someone sleeping. Someone would light the hearth again soon. Someone would grind grain for porridge. Somewhere, an elder would fall asleep, mid-sentence, telling a story no one remembered the start of. Life, in this Viking village, moved forward not in leaps, but in small, quiet steps. There would be no battles today. No great decisions. Just mending and meals and the soft return of men who had been away. There's nothing left of the storm but memory. And even that would fade like footprints in snow. In the coming days. Routines would return. Fields would need tending. Nets would be cast again. Wool would be spun. Boots would be patched. But for now, as the sky turned pale with evening, and the hearths glowed once more behind timber walls, the village simply rested, wrapped in quiet, embraced by time, as still and slow as the fjord itself. And somewhere, not far, a man took off his boots and lay back on a sheepskin, listening to the crackle of the fire, his fingers already forgetting the feel of an ore. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, but tonight was for silence, where the smoke rises slowly, and no one is in a hurry. The night had passed gently, the kind of night that settles in with a hush, not with wind or rain, but with the soft exhale of the land resting. A peaceful, ordinary sleep beneath a sky speckled with stars and then clouds, and then stars, Again got now. Morning arrived in the quiet way it always did, without knocking. Without hurry, the longhouse was still dim, its wooden walls breathing faintly in the cool air. The fire at the center had burned down to coals soft, red glowing, pulsing in the half-light like the heartbeat of the home. Outside, a breeze wandered lazily through the village, rustling hay, brushing the tips of thatched roofs, stirring the loose ends of woven door coverings. But inside, everything was still, a gentle creak from the rafters, the whisper of a blanket being pushed aside. And the longhouse slowly stirred to life. Somewhere in the shadows, a dog stretched, thumped its tail once, and yawned. One of the children stirred, but didn't rise yet. Just shifted beneath a woolen blanket and let out a sleepy sigh, the kind of sound that means, not yet, just a little longer. Above the hearth, a blackened pot hung motionless, waiting for the day's first stew. Nearby, dried herbs hung in tight bundles from the ceiling beams. Thyme, angelica, wild garlic swaying slightly as someone moved past. A woman, wrapped in a thick shawl, stepped barefoot onto the packed earthen floor. She crouched by the hearth and stirred the coals with a stick, coaxing them back to flame. Tiny sparks leapt and died. She leaned forward, blew gently. The smoke began to rise. Mornings in the longhouse weren't sudden. They unfolded one family. One roof, a dozen small sounds blending into the low hum of daily life. A ladle dipping into water. The squeak of a wooden door as someone stepped out to check the weather. The scratch of a spoon on the inside of a clay pot, scraping yesterday's porridge from the bottom. There were no clocks, no alarms. Only the slow brightening of the sky through the smoke hole above. And even that was often covered in cloud. You woke when the light told you to. You moved when your bones agreed. And until then, there was nothing to chase Dot in one corner. An old man rubbed his hands together and muttered to himself about how cold the floor always was. His wife, still half asleep beside him, offered no reply. She'd heard it before Dot and another. A teenage boy sat upright, combing his hair with a bone comb, methodically. Not because it mattered to anyone, but because it gave his fingers something to do while he waited for the world to finish waking up. A girl helped her younger sister pull on a woolen tunic. There was a quiet moment between them shared eyes. A braid adjusted, a giggle muffled behind a hand. The stew began to bubble gently. Not today's stew, not yet. Just the remnants of last night's, warming again. Leek, a bit of barley, and maybe a piece of salted fish that had melted into everything else. The smell crept through the longhouse like a familiar story one you didn't really listen to, but always heard. The woman tending the pot gave it a lazy stir, then covered it again. There was no rush. Breakfast would come when it was ready, not a moment before. Outside, someone was chopping kindling. Not fast, not loud. Just a steady rhythm. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke. And somewhere faintly, the sea. Always the sea. Even when you couldn't see it. A man stepped into the longhouse, shaking the mist from his cloak. His boots were muddy. He carried nothing but a small bundle of twigs and a look that said, "It's colder than I thought." His wife took the twigs, placed them near the fire, and handed him a wooden bowl. He sat down, slowly, the old way, with a sigh, any signs. Of the sun? She asked him. He shook his head. Not yet. But the birds are pretending. She nodded. Birds are optimists. Chores began in no particular order. One boy took up a broom made from tied birch branches and swept the floor, pushing yesterday's dirt toward the door. He didn't mind the work. It gave him a reason to hum. A woman began to comb out raw wool, tugging it gently across a wooden carding board. The soft rasping filled the space like the sound of someone brushing long hair. Others checked shoes for holes. Folded blankets. Sorted beans from last year's harvest. No one barked orders. Things simply happened, as they always had, in their own time. A toddler toddled barefoot across the room, tripped over nothing, and sat down hard. He looked around, not to cry, but to see if anyone had noticed. A few gentle smiles met him. Someone patted the floor beside them, and he crawled over. Curling against their side like a small cat dot, no one said anything. It was all perfectly ordinary, Dot, and sometimes the ordinary is exactly what we need, Dot, in the rafters. A chicken stirred. Not for the first time, not for the last. Longhouses often had animals inside goats in the back stall, chickens in corners. The occasional stray cat that knew how to keep mice at bay. Dot, their presence was comforting, a reminder that life was here. Moving, softly, growing. The morning wore on. More firewood was brought in. The stew, now warm enough, was ladled into bowls and passed around. There wasn't enough for anyone to be full, but it was enough not to be hungry, which in a Viking household was more than acceptable. A few people chewed quietly, staring into the fire. Others ate while fixing torn seams or untangling rope. Dot, and always the sounds of a home alive but gently, the clink of a spoon against a wooden bowl, the scrape of wool against stone, the pop of a coal, the low rumble of someone clearing their throat. Dot, no one talked about raids. Or gods, even. Dot, not today. Dot, today was for wooden wool and warmth. And waiting for the sun to climb just a little higher. Later, a young woman would go to fetch water. A boy would gather eggs. A man would disappear into the trees with an axe over his shoulder. Not to cut, but just to check what had fallen overnight. But for now, everyone was here, together, beneath one roof. Beneath one fire. Dot, at the back of the longhouse, the grandmother finally woke. She blinked, sat up, looked around at all the quiet motion. Still here? She said softly, her voice like a faded leaf. Someone nodded. Still here. She smiled. Good. And with that, she reached for her comb. The longhouse had many days like this. Days where the world didn't demand anything special. Where the morning gave itself slowly, like warm bread being broken apart. Where time moved not by minutes, but by motions. The kind of motions you don't even think about. You just do them. Because your mother did, and hers before her. Dot, there was peace in that. A kind of peace that doesn't need to announce itself. Dot, it just is. Dot, and so the morning passed, one soft breath at a time. The fire was tended, the bowls were washed. A child napped again, curled in the lap of someone humming softly. The stew pot hung empty now, cleaned with a scrap of bread and a patient hand. Outside, the mist had lifted a little, revealing the dull, wet glow of the mountains beyond. Nothing had happened. Not really, and yet everything had begun. Dot, just as it always did. The farmer's rhythm, where the soil listens. The sky watches, and the work never hurries. The light outside the longhouse changed slowly, as if the sun itself were unsure whether to rise fully or not. The air was cool in the way that wraps around your arms and whispers, take your time. Far from the fjord, just beyond the last of the clustered homes, the village fields stretched open in soft curves, sleepy beneath a pale sky. The grass was heavy with dew. A crow sat on the fence post, tilting its head, watching the world begin in silence, and down a narrow path of packed earth and last year's straw. A man walked with deliberate steps, his boots damp, his breath steady. He didn't speak. There was no one to speak to yet. Only the land. And the land didn't answer with words. Farming in this Viking village was not romantic. It was not dramatic. It was not even particularly rewarding, but it was rhythm, a rhythm that could be felt more than heard. The man reached his plot, set down his bundle, a tool wrapped in cloth, a bit of yesterday's bread, and a small carved wooden idol worn smooth from years of thumb stroking. He knelt, pressed one hand into the dirt, and exhaled through his nose, still damp. Good. Dot, there were rows here, faint and orderly, traced from seasons past. The ghosts of last year's barley crop still whispered through the soil, though their golden stalks were long gone. He pulled at a stubborn root. It gave after a moment, not with drama, but with a satisfying little pop. He liked that sound. Across the fields, others began to appear, shadows, at first, then figures. One carried a hoe over his shoulder. Another led a pair of oxen with a yoke. That creaked gently. A woman in a dark apron carried a basket, not for gathering, but for scattering seeds. Most likely. No one called out. Everyone already knew what the day held. There would be soil to turn. Stones to move, weeds to pluck, barley to sell, and time hours of it to do each. Slowly, the farmer picked up his hoe and began to move the earth. Not with power, not with urgency, just steadily. He worked in lines, letting his thoughts drift like birds on wind. He thought about a cracked bowl at home that needed mending, about whether the sheep had found their way back through the gate last night, about the smell of stew this morning. He did not think about raids, or boats, or stories of gods battling giants. He thought about turnips above him. Clouds moved lazily. The sky was wide here, open in a way that made time feel stretched and gentle. Sometimes a breeze would come, brushing over the field and fluttering his tunic just a little. He'd stop then, lean on the hose-worn handle, and squint up. Still here, he'd murmur. Not to anyone. Just to the sky. Near the edge of the plot, a crow pecked at something shiny. The farmer watched it for a moment, then turned back to his row. It wasn't about getting the job done. It was about doing it. And doing it again tomorrow. A few fields over, an old man named Havden muttered to his oxen. You pull like your father. Slow as morning. The oxen, as always, said nothing. They pulled the plow in their own time, the wooden blade carving a shallow line through the dark soil. Havden didn't mind. He liked talking to things that didn't answer. A child ran through the edge of the grass, chasing a stick that had become a sword, or a dragon, or a magic staff. The farmer glanced up and smiled. The child tripped, got up, dusted off their knees, and ran again. The grown-ups said nothing. Everyone had once chased something across these fields. By midday, the sun had peeked through the clouds just enough to warm the back of his neck. The farmer paused, sat on a stone near the edge of his field, and chewed the rest of his bread. He sipped from a small leather flask filled with weak ale, not enough to feel, just enough to taste. The stone was warm. The earth, freshly turned, smelled rich and soft. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, even though there was no sea in. Say, it didn't matter. Sounds wandered here. He ran his fingers through the dirt beside his boot, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. It was fine soil. Not perfect, but good enough. That was all he ever asked for. Good enough. The land owed him nothing. Back to work. His shadow grew longer behind him. Across the field, Havden had given up speaking and now simply hummed a tune that no one else knew. The oxen plodded along like they had for years. The furrows deepened. A woman walked by carrying a bundle of rye straw, her feet silent on the earth. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to dot. This was their song, this rhythm. Quiet, constant, and shared. Later, he paused again. Leaning on his hoe, a cloud had drifted across the sun, and for a moment, the light turned silver gray. He liked that part of the day, the part where the land cooled just slightly, as if exhaling. He picked up a small stone, smooth and round, and slipped it into his pouch. Not for any reason, just because some things were worth carrying for no reason at all. And then, as the afternoon melted toward evening, the shadows lengthened and the soil began to cool beneath his boots. He rubbed the sweat from his brow with his sleeve and surveyed. What he had done, not everything was finished, not even half, but the rows were straight. The weeds had been softened. The earth was listening again. That was enough. He gathered his things slowly, wrapping the cloth bundle, slipping the idol back into his pocket, brushing loose soil from his knees. He turned once to look back at the plot, then nodded, then walked. On as he made his way home, he passed Havden, who was still beside his oxen. Rain tomorrow? The farmer asked. Havden shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. They both smiled. Neither of them really minded either way. Past the fence, through the grass, up the little path that led back to the village. The same path he'd walked every day for years. The same rhythm in his steps. The same soil on his boots, and as he reached the top of the hill, he paused to look down at the patchwork of fields. Below, the smoke rising in slow swirls from chimneys. The figure still working in the distance, patient and quiet. Nothing had changed. Not much, anyway. A few more furrows. A few fewer weeds, but that was the point. The land asked only for time. And time they had the farmer step back into the longhouse, the smell of ash and stew and warmth wrapping around him like a familiar blanket. The tools would be set by the door. The boots left muddy, the body tired in the best kind of way. And tomorrow the field would wait again, not with urgency, but with welcome, weaving time, threads cross, and days pass, and that is enough. The village rested beneath a gray sky that neither threatened rain nor promised sun, just a sky like wool, stretched thin and soft across the hills. A sky for quiet things dot inside one longhouse. Near the edge of the fields, a woman sat at her loom. The morning chores were done. The goats had been fed. The herbs stirred in the breeze, drying slowly on their ropes above the hearth. A stew simmered faintly in the background, just as it always did. The woman shifted in her seat, ran her hands across the loom, and began to work. A wooden shuttle passed through the threads, pulled gently from one side to the other dot. It was a rhythm so quiet that you didn't notice it at first. But once you did, it stayed with you calm, patient, steady. There was no rush. No need to finish the weaving quickly. Clothes didn't grow on trees. And even if they did, they would still take time to gather, to stitch, to shape. Wool had to be sheared, washed, combed, spun. Then, and only then, did the loom come into play. The woman's fingers moved with a calm certainty. They knew this path. They didn't need her eyes, most of the time. Around her, the longhouse breathed gently. A child hummed near the doorway, half speaking to herself as she sorted pebbles by color. An older woman, a cousin, maybe combed. Flax in the corner, teasing out each strand like a lullaby in motion. There was no talking just yet. Only the soft sounds of thread sliding against thread. The cloth that formed on the loom was pale. The natural gray of sheep's wool, speckled here and there with bits of straw that hadn't quite washed out. She didn't mind. Perfection wasn't expected. Usefulness was enough. She worked slowly, adjusting the tension, smoothing out a bump, pausing to sip water from a cup shaped like a curled leaf, and then, clack, she returned to the rhythm. Outside, the breeze moved gently through the door flap. It carried the smells of turned earth, of distant smoke, of cows waiting for milking. But inside, time passed differently. It drifted. It circled. Two more women entered, each carrying a basket. One with dyed wool in muted blues and mossy greens. The other with spindles and combs. They greeted each other with nods and half smiles. No need for words. They'd shared mornings like this more times than they could count. One woman sat beside the hearth and began spinning. Her spindle whirled with a lazy grace, bobbing in rhythm with her breath. The other sat across from the loom and began sorting the colored wool, picking out bits of debris, teasing the fibers open, hands moving as naturally as breath. A low voice finally broke the silence. "I dreamed last night that I was weaving water," said the woman at the loom. The others looked up briefly, then smiled. "What did it feel like?" asked the spinner. "Cool, but not cold," the weaver replied. "It moved on its own. I couldn't keep the pattern straight." "That's because you can't fold water," said the woman with the wool, plucking a burr from the green. They chuckled softly. And the shuttle passed through the threads again. Their talk wasn't lively. It wandered, the way old roads do, meandering and unsure of their destination. They spoke of how the sheep had seemed restless the night before, of how one husband had snored louder than usual, of how the herbs drying above had faded from green to silver overnight. None of it was urgent. None of it mattered. And yet all of it mattered. It was part of the rhythm of weaving not just cloth but life. Children drifted in and out of the room, as they always did, sometimes to ask for a bite of bread, sometimes to show a particularly shiny rock. One small girl, barely past toddlerhood, crawled beneath the loom, settled at her mother's feet, and rested her head on her knees. The shuttle moved. Clack. The threads tightened. The day grew. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. A door creaked in the neighboring house. Somewhere far off, someone shouted a name, but not loudly. Inside, Someone began to hum. It wasn't a song with words. It might not have even been a song, just a string of soft notes rising and falling like woven strands, never needing to go. Anywhere, the cloth was longer now. The pattern, simple but clear, was beginning to show. Faint stripes and alternating grays and browns. Uneven, unapologetic. This cloth would be a tunic. Or maybe a blanket, or maybe it would wait on a shelf for a year before someone decided what it wanted to be. That was fine. Chewed out the spindle word. The wool was combed. The loom clacked quietly. Later, they would set the weaving aside and knead bread. They would heat stones to warm water for bathing. Someone would scrub a cloak that smelled of smoke. Someone else would darn a sock where the toe had worn through. But for now, there was thread and light and the feel of time slipping gently forward, like a tide that asked for nothing. But presence stopped. The day went on like this, slowly, softly, almost unnoticed. When the light began to fade, someone brought in a bit of moss to add to the fire. Another woman began folding the spun wool, placing it in a chest that creaked when it opened. A chicken wandered in, stood by the hearth, and was gently shooed. Back out with a foot in a quiet, "Not you, not now." The child beneath the loom had fallen asleep. A small pool of drool gathered near her cheek, and no one minded. The weaving paused. The hands rested. The cloth waited. Outside. The first stars blinked behind a veil of pale cloud. The wind slowed. Inside. The fire dimmed, and the loom stood quiet. Nothing had been finished. But everything had been done, and the threads, like the people, would wait until tomorrow to begin again. The fisherman's hours, before the light. Before the world stirs, the lake waits. In the early hours before the smoke of breakfast, before the sounds of chores, before the first rooster dared to clear its throat, there was the lake. Still. Cold, quiet, not even a ripple. Not yet. A fisherman, wrapped in a woolen cloak still damp from yesterday's mist, stepped into the hush. His boots made soft prints in the dew-covered grass. No one spoke, not the trees, not the sky, not even the gulls. He reached the edge of the shore, where his little boat waited. Tucked in a bend of the lake, pulled slightly up on the stones, its bottom scarred from years of landings, its oars resting like folded arms, he set down his net. A coil of rope, a carved wooden bowl with a bit of dry bread inside. Just enough. He didn't hurry. The fish weren't going anywhere. The lake stretched out before him, a mirror of the still gray sky. Mist clung to the surface like a breath not yet exhaled. Far across the water, a dark smudge of trees lay against the horizon, their tips soft with distance. He stepped into the boat. It rocked gently, not protesting. And with a slow, practiced rhythm, he pushed away from the shore. The oars moved through the water like they'd done 1,000 mornings before. Each stroke so smooth that it barely made a sound, only a soft ripple in his wake, vanishing before it reached the reeds. He liked this part of the day, not for the promise of fish, but for the quiet of being the first one out. He rowed out a ways, not too far. He wasn't young anymore, and the lake didn't need to be crossed. Just entered, just sat with. He slowed, then let the boat drift. The net lay beside him, heavy with the weight of its own waiting. He reached for it, ran his fingers along the rough lines. It had been mended many times by his wife, by his daughter, once by himself, though that knot never quite held right. He let the net fall into the water. The splash was soft. The lake accepted it. Then silence again. He leaned back in the boat, the cold wood pressing gently through his tunic. He rested the oars, crossed his arms, and waited. There's an art to waiting that only certain people ever learn. Fishermen know. At best, it's not about patience. It's about stillness, about noticing the way the mist curls, the way your breath looks in the air, the way the lake, despite being wide and deep, seems to hold its breath for you. The fisherman closed his eyes. Not to sleep, just to listen better. A soft sound. A drip, maybe, or the flap of a wing. Then nothing. Time passed. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just passed. The net, gently moving beneath the surface. swayed with currents too light to see. He reached for his wooden bowl, broke the dry bread in half, and chewed. It tasted the same as yesterday and the day before. He liked that. Consistency had its own flavor. Eventually, he pulled the net in dot. It came up with the familiar resistance of water. And effort. His arms strained just a little, not from the weight, but from repetition. Two fish, small, silver, beautiful in their simplicity. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. Just set them in a bucket lined with damp moss. Sometimes that was all he caught. Sometimes none. That was fine. You couldn't make the lake give. You could only ask quietly and see what it offered. He cast the net again. The clouds above lightened, not to blue, but to a softer gray. The reeds at the water's edge began to sway. Not from wind, but because something, perhaps a duck or a fox, or just the weight of the day had moved through them. He watched. Later, another fisherman paddled out across the water. A younger man, cheerful but quiet, raised a hand in greeting. The older man nodded once, then looked away. There's no need to speak. Not out here. He pulled the net in once more. One fish, long and thin. It flopped slightly, then stilled. The lake remained quiet by midday. The sky had begun to shift. Not with color, not with urgency, just with light. A faint sun behind the clouds. Enough to soften the chill on his face. The fisherman picked up the oars again. He rowed slowly toward shore. When the boat crunched softly onto the stones, he stepped out, his knees creaking with effort. He pulled the boat a little higher, tied it to the post with the same knot as always. He lifted the bucket. Not heavy just enough back in the village. He walked past the drying racks, already strung with fish from earlier days. Past the fire pit where someone tended coals for smoking. Past the rows of herbs, past the children, past the goats. He didn't speak, but someone saw him pass and nodded. He brought the fish to the back of the longhouse where a flat stone slab waited. He laid them out gently. Took a knife from its place on the wall. He cleaned them with slow, practiced movements. The blade made soft sounds against the bone. The wind rustled in the grass. Later, the fish would be cooked in stew, or smoked and wrapped in cloth to store for winter. Some pieces might be traded, but for now, he rinsed his hands in a wooden basin, dried them on a scrap of old wool, and sat down on the bench by the door. His daughter brought him a cup of something. Warm. She sat beside him. They didn't speak. The lake was already behind him. But its stillness lingered. The scent of moss, water, and wind clung to his cloak. He let his eyes close just for a moment. There would be other moorings, other nets, other weights. But this one had passed gently, and that was all he ever asked. The village echoes, a step in the snow, a creak of wood, a memory told again. The day was still early, but the stillness was beginning to shift, not abruptly, not loudly. Just a quiet stirring as if the village had taken a long breath. And was now exhaling outside. The sun hung where behind the clouds. Its warmth not strong enough to melt the dew, but present enough to brighten the frost into something soft and from across the little homes and sheds, longhouses and lean-tos, came the sounds that made up a normal day. Not the clang of swords, not the shouts of warriors, just the usual, a child's laugh, far away, carried on the breeze. Then another not the kind of laugh that comes from anything particularly funny. More the kind that bubbles up when someone runs too fast and almost trips over their own boots. When someone tries to skip a stone on a puddle and ends up splashing their own face. Simple things at the edge of the village. In the space between two buildings where the grass hadn't grown in years, a group of children played their favorite game with rules that changed every few minutes and made perfect sense to no one but them. One child dragged a stick behind her as she walked in circles, drawing shapes that only she understood. Another crouched near the wall, stacking pebbles carefully, 2 gray, 1 white. Then a feather on top. Their voices came in little bursts, giggling, murmuring, a moment of silence. Then a squeal as someone's mitten was stolen and held high in the air. Nearby, A grandmother sat on a low stool with a basket of turnips in her lap. She wasn't peeling them. Not yet. She was watching. Her eyes, soft and heavy-lidded, followed. The children. Her hands rested on the rim of the basket, still and patient. A faint smile moved at the edge of her mouth, as if she were remembering a different game. A different set of small voices. Long ago. After a while, a child wandered over. To her. Tell the story, he said softly, as if it were a secret. She blinked slowly. Which one? She asked. Those she already knew. The one with the raven and the oatcake. She sighed, but not unhappily. All right. And so in the slowest, most winding voice imaginable, she began, well, there was a man who had a raven. Not clever raven. Just a regular one, with dull feathers and a beak that was a little too long. The story wandered, took turns it didn't warn about, repeated itself a few times, and the child, without realizing, leaned against her knee and started drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Across the village, wood creaked, not loudly, just the sound of a door shifting open, then closed again, inside. Someone turned a pot on a hook. The broth inside sloshed lazily. A bench scraped as someone moved to sit. A soft hum rose from one of the houses. A lullaby. Maybe. Or just the sound someone made when they worked alone and forgot anyone might be listening. From the woods came the faint rhythm of axe chops. One. Pause. Another. Not hurried. Not urgent. Just someone gathering firewood. The sound echoed across the valley. Bounced gently off trees. Danced across rooftops. The village listened. Without really listening, it was part of the day, like smoke, like clouds, like breath. Children ran through puddles that had frozen in the night, cracking the thin ice with delighted stomps. One girl carefully lifted a piece of broken ice and held it to the sky. It looks like glass, she whispered. A boy beside her touched it with one finger and pulled away quickly. It's too cold, he said, before dropping it with a tiny crash in the distance. A dog barked once, then twice, then gave up. Another door creaked. A cartwheel groaned. A crow flapped low over the thatched roofs. Inside the longhouses. People sat together not because they had to, but because it was warmer that way. A woman mended a shirt, her needle making. Soft little pats against the fabric. A man beside her sanded a small wooden spoon, pausing now and then to blow away the dust. They didn't speak, but the silence was friendly. Outside, a boy practiced throwing a stone at a tree stump. He missed. He missed again, then again, but he didn't seem to mind. The stump wasn't going anywhere. Neither was the boy. The day drifted. Children became quieter. Some went inside. The grandmother had told the story twice now. The raven was still. Not very clever. She didn't mind. There was something soothing about saying the same lines, the same mistakes, the same laugh-out-loud moment when the oatcake fell in the well, and the child beside her had started to doze. His head rested on her arm now. She didn't move it. A breeze stirred the leaves on the ground. Not enough to lift them, just enough to remind them they were there. The axe in the forest still chopped. But more slowly now, the sun lowered behind the hill, not dramatically. It just lowered. And the echoes of the day grew softer. No one had accomplished much. Number. One had tried to, but things had happened. A sock was fixed. A story was told. A pebble tower stood briefly before being forgotten. And the village, wrapped in its own quiet rhythms, prepared for night once more. Market days, but not really. A path well walked, a pouch half full, and nothing much to buy. The air was still. When the sun rose, not bright, not golden, just present. A light the color of oat porridge, spreading softly across the landscape, waking no one in a hurry. This was market day. But not the kind from stories. Not the bustling, loud kind. No drums, no shouting, no deals struck in a rush. Just a quiet trail. And a few villagers preparing to walk it. Two women stood outside the longhouse, adjusting their cloaks against the morning's chill. One had a basket. The other held a small wool pouch with drawstrings knotted so often that they barely opened any more dot inside, or little things. A carved spoon, a twist of thread. A broken brooch someone might still find pretty. They weren't sure if anyone would want these, but it didn't matter much. The market wasn't about trading. It was about walking. The path to the village down the hill wound slowly, like everything else. It passed a stand of old pines, then a field with sheep that always stared but never moved Dot as they walked. The earth beneath their feet felt soft, half mud, half moss, and a little gravel thrown in from last summer's path mending. Their boots sank a little, then lifted again with gentle suction. Squish, squish, step. One of them sighed, but not from tiredness. Just to release the air she'd been holding. It might rain, she said, looking up at a sky that always looked like that. The other agreed. Dot. They kept walking. Farther down the trail, they met a man with a barrel strapped to his back. It wasn't very full, but it sloshed as he walked. He gave a nod, not stopping. Fish. One of the women asked quietly. Salted, the other replied. Probably yesterday's. They weren't looking to trade for fish. But they liked knowing it was there. Thought the village at the bottom of the hill was small. Just a few thatched houses, leaning into one another like tired friends. At its center stood a low table made of mismatched planks, sagging a little from years of damp mornings and slow dealings. That was the market. Dot. One table, some baskets, a few people milling about, not really doing anything. Dot. Perfect. Dot. They walked slowly between the baskets. Dot. Here, a bundle of woolen dyed, slightly musty. There, a stack of clay pots, each with a small chip somewhere. Next to those, a folded tunic coarse, practical, and deeply brown. Nothing was labeled. Nothing needed to be. You looked, you nodded. Sometimes you touched Dot, and if your fingers lingered long enough on something, someone might say, yours if you've got thread, or take it. I can't wear it anymore. And that was the trade. Dot. The two women stopped near an old man selling little iron hooks. He was sitting on a stool that sank unevenly into the dirt, whittling a stick that would probably become nothing in particular. Morning, he said. They nodded. Hooks? He offered. They looked. One of them picked one up, turned it in her hand. For hanging things? She asked. For losing things? He said with a quiet smile. She handed it back, just as quietly. A young boy wandered by, dragging a basket behind him. It had only one thing inside, an egg. Just one. He didn't try to sell it. He just carried it like it mattered. Time passed, a slow kind of passing. The kind where you forget whether you've stood in the same spot for minutes or hours. The two women made one trade. A twist of dyed yarn for a bar of soap that smelled faintly of rosemary. And smoked. Dot. It didn't seem like a fair deal, which meant it probably was. Dot. By midday. A soft drizzle had begun, not a rain worth hiding from, just the kind that left tiny droplets clinging to eyelashes and the hems of cloaks. People pulled up their hoods, not because they had to, because that's what you do. Dot. The market continued, quietly ignoring the weather. Dot. An old woman sat near the fire pit at the edge of the gathering. She wasn't selling anything. She just liked to be there. Dot. Someone handed her a piece of hard bread, and she nodded without smiling, as though this were the best part of the day. The two women started walking back slowly. Their basket was a little heavier, but not much. The soap, a handful of dried berries they hadn't planned to get, a scrap of cloth, frayed at the edges, but too pretty to leave behind. They didn't talk much on the way home. The sky had darkened, but only a little. The kind of dark that feels permanent, even though it's just afternoon. A bird flew overhead. Black, slow-winged, silent. Dot. By the time they reached the edge of their village again, the drizzle had stopped. Someone was splitting kindling nearby, the wood letting out small cracks with each strike. The longhouse door was open, letting out the smell of cabbage stew and smoke. One of the women reached into the basket and held up the soap. This'll make washing day less miserable, she said, almost smiling. The other nodded. A little, and that was it. That was market day. Dot. Nothing new, nothing grand. Dot. Just a slow walk. A small trade, familiar faces, and A reminder that the world, however uneventful, still turned. Law and order, slowly. A stone out of place. A sheep gone missing. 100 voices, all very polite. It was late morning, and the mist had begun to lift, though not all the way. It clung still in the corners of the hills and the edges of the field, slow to leave. Much like the people who now gathered at the edge of the pasture. This was the thing. The law gathering, the meeting of minds of neighbors, of mild disputes, and of hours and hours of talking. Very little shouting, even less excitement, but plenty of standing around. They met in a clearing, marked not by anything built, but by where the grass had been trodden down so many times before. There was a tree stump someone had sat on since before anyone remembered, and near it, a large stone flat, wide and mostly level, used for speaking. If anyone ever felt brave enough to step up on it, not many did. The villagers arrived slowly. A man with a walking stick in no real hurry. A woman holding her toddler's hand, her other hand tucked into a pouch filled with oatcakes. 2 brothers, with identical shrugs and identical fur cloaks, neither wanting to speak first. A farmer with a sheep that had wandered into someone else's field 2 weeks ago and hadn't been returned yet, even though it clearly had his mark on its ear. That was the big dispute of the day. No. One seemed upset that it wasn't the kind of place where anyone wanted to fight. The thing was where you talked until everything felt less important. Until the problem seemed smaller, or at least quieter. The wind picked up a little. It rustled the heather and made the long grass lean gently in one direction. A raven croaked from a branch overhead, then fluttered off when no one offered food. Someone cleared their throat. A conversation began. It wasn't dramatic. It started like this. I think that sheep might be mine. Someone else said, which one? The white one. They're all white. Well, this one has a mark. What kind of mark? They stood in a soft circle, I always put on voices low, a long pause, heads tilted slightly to one side like trees that had grown. Used to leaning in the wind, an old man repeated the rules of sheep barking, slowly. Not because he forgot them, but because he liked how they sounded when said out loud. Another man mentioned something about fences. Another mentioned something about how the fences didn't always matter. Someone else nodded and said, that's true. The conversation wandered. Meanwhile, others sat in the grass, leaning back on their hands. Children lay on their bellies, drawing in the dirt with bits of twig. No one asked them to be quiet. There was no need. The thing was not a ceremony. It was more like a shared pause. Another dispute came up. A pile of stones had been moved, someone said, and they were fairly certain that pile was a boundary, or it might have been a marker for something else. But either way, it had been moved. By the river? Someone asked. No, near the old path. The one with the crooked birch tree. Ah, the stones would have to be moved back. Or not. Someone would check on it tomorrow. Probably. Hours. Past. Someone passed around a small leather pouch of dried berries. A few people chewed them slowly, hands tucked in sleeves, eyes following a cloud overhead. Another person carved something into a stick. A name, maybe, or just shapes. He wasn't really watching what he was doing. No one seemed in a rush. Now, and then a dog barked, not loudly, just enough to remind everyone it was still there. Someone mentioned a fence that needed mending. Another nodded. I have extra nails, he said. Bring them when you remember. Someone else replied. The sheep dispute continued on and off, drifting in and out like a slow breeze. Eventually, a quiet agreement was made. The man who had the sheep would keep it for now, but if it gave birth, the lamb would belong to the man who said it was his. Everyone nodded. This seemed fair. The sheep, nearby, chewed grass with a complete lack of interest. By late afternoon, the wind had settled, and the mist had finally gone. The clearing was warmer now. Not hot, just enough to loosen a few cloaks and invite a few. Deep yawns. The toddler, who had been mostly silent, was now asleep on his mother's lap. She gently rocked back and forth, though there was no rhythm to it. No one mentioned it. But everyone noticed. Another man stood slowly. I'd like to say something. he said, brushing crumbs off his tunic. He stepped up onto the flat stone, cleared his throat, looked around at all the quiet faces, and then he forgot what he meant to say. Everyone waited politely. He looked down, furrowed his brow, then shrugged and stepped off again. That's all right, someone said. You'll remember next time. And that was that. Eventually, people began to drift away. The children got up first, chasing each other down the hill with sudden bursts of energy. The older men stayed longer, talking about the weather next week, and whether the soil would need more ash. A woman braided her daughter's hair while listening to someone talk about the best way to stack firewood. The law had been spoken, not imposed, just shared, like a warm cup passed around slowly, without spilling. Back in the village, smoke curled from the rooftops. The scent of fish and onions wafted through the air. The sheep had been led away, still chewing, and the flat stone in the clearing stood alone again, waiting patiently for the next time someone forgot what they wanted to say. Rainy days and muddy. Boots. A sigh against the window. A day without sky. The sound of rain again. It rained that morning. Not suddenly, not violently, just the kind of rain that starts before you wake up and never quite makes up its mind to stop. A slow, even rhythm. Like fingers drumming gently on a tabletop. It tapped on the roof, slid down the beams, gathered in puddles that reflected the dull gray sky like pools of old pewter. There would be no farming today. No fishing either, only the longhouse, and the quiet hum of everyone inside, waiting for the rain to change its mind. Inside the longhouse, the air was thicker than usual, smoky, warm, and edged with the smell of wet wool. Boots lined the entrance. In a neat row, some caked with yesterday's dried mud, others dripping gently onto the straw floor. The hearth crackled in the middle, though the fire wasn't doing much. It hissed now and then as damp logs protested their fate. Someone stirred the stew pot, slowly, absently. With a carved wooden spoon that had seen many days like this, a man sat by the wall, sharpening a blade he hadn't used in weeks. Not for battle, just a knife for cutting roots, cleaning fish, shaping firewood. He wasn't really sharpening it, not seriously. More passing the stone over it in slow, familiar arcs, as if the motion itself was the point. His son sat beside him, doing nothing at all, just staring at the blade, at the fire. At the ceiling, a woman spun wool with heavy hands, the drop spindle twisting like a little sleepy dance. It wasn't going well. The fibers were damp, uncooperative. Still, she spun. Because what else was there to do? The longhouse was filled, not with voices, but with sounds. The soft thunk of the spoon in the pot. The occasional cough, the scrape of a boot across the floor. The slow creak of the rafters above, leaning into the weight of the weather. And always the rain. Falling, sliding. Tapping. Children played a quiet game in the corner, some kind of pretend. Cooking with pebbles and scraps of cloth. The youngest one insisted the soup needed more pine cones. No one disagreed. One child, tired of play, traced a shape on the fogged-up wall, first a spiral, then a boat, then just lines that melted into streaks when his sleeve brushed them. An older man, half asleep and wrapped in two cloaks, cleared his throat softly and began to speak, not to anyone in particular, not even very loudly. It was a story he'd told before. Maybe last week, maybe every rainy day. The time the river rose too high, he began, eyes half closed, and the goats had to be brought into the house, all of them, and one of them wouldn't stop sneezing. Someone smiled. Someone else yawned about the story. Wandered. It forgot itself halfway through and doubled back. But no one minded. It wasn't the story that mattered. It was the voice. Outside, the path through the village had turned to soft, sucking mud. A chicken stood motionless under the eaves. Feathers fluffed against the drizzle. A dog lay curled in a dry patch near the wall, one eye open. Rain slid down every roof, gathered in the hollows of tree stumps, pooled at the base of every fence post. Inside, someone began to hum. A slow tune, almost tuneless, but steady. It wasn't meant for performance. just something to keep the fingers moving while stitching. But Tornhem thought someone else joined in, quietly, maybe even unknowingly. The sounds overlapped thread and hum and stew and rain dot at some point. Someone sighed loudly dot then someone else, not unhappily. Just because it was a sighing sort of day dot time passed slowly, more than one person dozed. Heads tipped back, mouths slightly open. Forgotten tasks still held loosely in their laps. A boy woke from a short nap and watched. Smoke curl upward through the hole in the roof. He blinked. Counted how many curls it took before the smoke disappeared into the dark clouds above. He lost count and started over. The stew was eaten early, not because anyone was hungry, but because it gave everyone something to do that was warm and bland, tasting mostly of onion and barley and patience dot in the afternoon. A woman told a story about her uncle who once mended a roof in the middle of a storm. Using only his coat, a fishbone, and a lot of swearing dot, no one laughed loudly. They just smiled. At the parts they liked, a man near the door added, "It probably leaked anyway." Everyone nodded dot by evening. The fire had grown smaller. The rain hadn't stopped, but no one expected it to. The village would still be there tomorrow. So would the rain. So would the boots and the stew and the voices. The children had fallen. Asleep on straw mats near the hearth, curled like cats, cheeks pink from the warmth, dot one woman gently tugged a blanket over them. Her hand lingered a moment on her daughter's hair, brushing it smooth dot the spinning had stopped. The carving had stopped. Even the stories had quieted dot, but the rain still fell. Not heavily. Not miserably. Just consistently. Like breath. Like sleep. Like the earth whispering to itself. Long nights by the fire. No rush. No roar. Just story smoke and sleeping breath. The rain had finally stopped. Not with a sudden break, but with a slow, reluctant pause like someone slipping quietly out of a room without saying goodbye. The world outside the longhouse was wet and still. Inside, the fire glowed low. Not crackling anymore, just humming softly to itself, as if singing the same note over and over. Too tired for melody, dot the hearthstones were warm. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, boiled grain, and damp wool that would never quite dry, and the night had settled in fully. A long, unbroken stretch of darkness. No stars. Just the feeling that they were up there somewhere, waiting their turn dot. Most of the longhouse had gone quiet, dot children lay on blankets stuffed with straw and feathers. Their little feet twitched beneath layers of wool and linen. A soft snore came. From somewhere near the wall, steady, unbothered, almost musical in its rhythm. And yet, a few still sat by the fire, dot not for warmth, not entirely, but because it was evening and this is what evenings were for words. For wood carving, for slow thoughts that didn't quite finish. An old man cleared his throat, not loudly, just enough to signal the beginning of something. He held a carved stick in his lap half finished, smoothed by the slow polish of a thumb moving back and forth without thinking. I was younger when this happened. He began, though no one had asked. No one needed to. He was always younger in his stories. Across from him, a woman stirred a pot of leftover broth, not to cook it, just to keep her hands busy. Her eyes were half closed. She liked this story, even though she knew how it went. There was a tree, the old man said, not too far from the ridge where the goats used to wander. Big thing, bent like it had a secret. He paused, let the silence breathe around him. It creaked in the wind. He went on like it was speaking, but only if you were quiet enough to listen. The boy nearest the fire blinked slowly. He was already drifting. The words were not really the point. It was the shape of them, the way they filled the room like soft wool in an old coat. The old man kept talking. The story unfolded in slow curls, nothing dangerous, nothing daring. Just a walk. A mistake about some footprints. And a goat that wasn't where it should have been. Everyone knew how it ended. Still, they listened. Because it's not about what happened. It's about how it's told. A woman nearby carved a small wooden charm. The kind meant to hang near the bedpost. Not for luck, really just for comfort. She worked without looking down much, the knife making tiny scratching sounds, like a beetle walking across a dry leaf. Next to her, someone hummed. Just a low sound, not even a tune. A baby stirred and was gently patted back into dreams. The old man's voice slowed, as though he, too, was drifting. And by the time I turned around, he said, the goat was back, standing there like it never left. He gave a small shrug. That's how I remember it, anyway. No one spoke for a moment. Then someone near the back muttered, goats are strange. A few quiet chuckles, soft and low. The fire popped gently. Someone leaned forward to poke it, not to stir it up, just to keep it from falling asleep too fast. A log shifted, sighed, and settled deeper into the embers dot outside. The wind whispered against the thatched roof, not trying to get in, just brushing past. Inside, feet were tucked closer under blankets. Someone yawned into their sleeve. Another pulled a cloak tighter around their shoulders. The old man had stopped talking. Not because the story was over and just wandered off. No one minded. Another woman spoke. Her voice like thick cloth, heavy and soft. My mother used to tell a story. She said about a bear that lived in a hollow log. Not a big bear. Just small enough to talk if you knew how to listen. She didn't finish the story. She just let the idea of it float there. And that was enough. Carvings continued in silence. One man was working on a spoon. He hadn't made a spoon in weeks. This one had a curved handle, almost too long to be practical, but it felt nice in the hand. That was enough reason to keep going. The baby cooed once, then fell silent again. A woman rubbed her own hands together, old hands, calloused and clever, and looked at them as if they might begin a project. But they didn't. They just rested in her lap. Then, as the hour deepened and the fire grew quieter still, a boy's voice, half asleep, murmured into the room. Will there be another story tomorrow? A pause. Then someone said, there's always another story. No one said anything else. The glow from the hearth was faint now. It cast long shadows, gentle, swaying, the kind you don't notice until you're nearly dreaming. Above, the roof creaked. Outside, a bird called once and then went quiet again. And within the longhouse, the last of the words drifted upward into the beams like smoke. Soft, wandering, forgettable, perfect. Simple feasts, warm bread, wooden bowls, and the joy of nothing. Unexpected, the sun rose without a sound. A thin strip of pale gold stretched across the horizon. Not quickly, not proudly, just there. A quiet promise. The clouds drifted lazily overhead, not quite ready to decide what kind of day they wanted. To be inside the longhouse, someone yawned. Then someone else. A low stretch of shoulders, a pull of a blanket back over the knees. It wasn't morning exactly. At least not aloud. Kind of morning. It was the beginning of the part of the day where food would be made. Not a feast in the way of songs or shouting or meat piled on shields. Just food. Warm food. Simple food. And all the comfort that came with it. In a corner near the hearth. A woman was already kneading dough. Her sleeves were rolled. Her hands moved slowly, steadily, pressing and folding with the same rhythm she'd used the day before. And the day before that. The dough sighed beneath her fingers, soft, springy, not too dry. A bowl of crushed grain sat nearby. Oats and barley, mostly. A pinch of salt. A little water. A little time. The smell came first, warm and nutty. A scent that filled the longhouse gently, like steam curling up from a cup. People noticed, but didn't speak of it. They just lifted their heads slightly, breathed in a little deeper. Elsewhere, a boy was slicing cheese-thick wedges with the blunt edge of a wooden knife. It wasn't a hard cheese, just firm enough to hold its shape. A little tangy, a little sour. Beside him, someone laid out the bowls wooden, a bit uneven. Carved years ago, it used hundreds of times since. One had a crack sealed with tree resin. One was shaped like a fish. No one remembered who had carved that one, but it always made the children smile. The bread was set on flat stones near the fire, not baked so much as browned firm on the outside, tender on the inside. Steam curled from the edges as it was torn. the crust crackling ever so softly. There was no butter, no jam, just bread, and it was perfect that way. A pot of broth simmered gently, full of yesterday's leftovers and a few soft new roots added in. It wasn't much. Mostly water, onions, herbs, and a handful of barley. But it smelled like home, like every day before. And that, in itself, was reason enough to smile. They didn't gather at a table. They sat where they were on furs, on benches, beside the fire. They passed the bowls by hand, nodded to one another, murmured soft thanks that didn't need to be spoken, allowed that was meat to not much. Just a shared cup passed around. It wasn't strong. It wasn't sweet, but it was warm on the tongue, and it made your chest feel as if someone had just told you a good story. A young girl licked her fingers. An old man tore off a bit of bread and handed it to the dog, who accepted it with a grateful huff and promptly fell asleep. Someone whispered a memory about a feast, long ago one, with goose and fish, and something sweet made from berries and snow no one really remembered. The taste. Only the warmth. And the laughter that came slowly and left slowly. On this morning, though, there was no celebration. No guests. No songs. Just the small joy of familiar food, familiar hands, and the calm of chewing in unhurried silence. A man chewed slowly and watched the steam rise from his bowl. He stirred the broth, even though it didn't need stirring. Not because he was thinking, but because they send single quotes with T. outside. The sky remained undecided blue in some places, silver in others. A raven croaked in the distance. A sheep sneezed. Somewhere water trickled over smooth stone. Inside, the fire kept burning. Low and easy. And a feast, if you could call it, that continued. More bread, more broth. A slice of dried fish passed to a child who wrinkled her nose, then chewed anyway. Later, when the bowls were empty and bellies comfortably full, no one rushed to stand. They simply leaned back, rubbed their hands, sighed, not out of boredom, but of quiet contentment. The kind that only comes after a simple meal eaten slowly. With people who've never had to explain themselves to each other, the woman who baked the bread smiled slightly. As she wiped her hands on a cloth, "It rose better this time," she said to no one in particular. Someone nodded. It did. That was all. That was enough. There would be other meals. Other mornings like this one. More barley. More stew. More bread shaped by hands that remembered the way without having to be told. Clothes and bones. Thread through needle. Hand on hide. Time sewn into everything. It was one of those days where the air felt still and thought no wind. No rain. Just a faint chill clinging to the air. Like a memory of winter that hadn't quite let go. The longhouse was quiet, but not silent. There was a kind of hush like the space between breaths, where work began not with noise, but with rhythm. And on this particular day, that rhythm was made of stitching, scraping, spinning, and soft talk that drifted like thread between the beams of the roof. A woman sat cross-legged on a folded sheepskin, needle in hand. The woolen tunic she held had frayed at the elbow. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of tear that happens slowly over time. She didn't rush. Each stitch was deliberate. Her fingers knew the fabric like they knew the curves of her child's face. Well, and without need for thought. The thread was pulled from twisted wool, dyed with onion skins into a soft gold color. Not bright, not showy, but warm in that way only home-dyed cloth can be. Beside her, another woman was mending shoes. Leather boots damp from yesterday's mud rested across her lap. She worked a bone awl into the sole with slow, steady pressure. Her fingers pressed against the hide, gums worn smooth from years of shaping, sewing, and softening. The smell of the leather was earthy and sharp, mixed with the faint scent of the tallow rubbed into its seams. A young girl sat nearby, watching. She wasn't sewing yet, just turning a bit of raw wool in her hands, pulling it apart, twisting, watching how it stretched. "You need to tease it first," the older woman said gently. The girl nodded, though. She didn't really know what that meant, but she liked the word tease. She whispered it to herself as she pulled the wool. Little puffs floating up like tiny clouds, in a corner. A man carved Dot not for beauty. Not for ceremony. Dot, he was making buttons. Small discs of bone from an old, co-bleached and dry. With rings like tree bark. Dot, he drilled tiny holes in them, 2 at a time, using a hand tool so simple it seemed like a toy. His back was a little hunched. His hands moved slowly, but the buttons piled up beside him like smooth little moons. Another man was sanding a spoon. Not because they needed another spoon. There were already plenty, but this one had a small crack, and the wood felt too sharp. Along the edge. Dot, so he worked it gently, rubbing with a scrap of old leather, humming as he did. The hum wasn't a song, just a tone. Something to keep time with. Dot, everything in the room was being made, or fixed, or softened. A pair of mittens patched for the 3rd time, a wool hood newly spun, still smelling faintly of sheep, a bone needle smoothed again after kitching, on a thread too thick. Dot, and behind it all, the creaking of the longhouse, the groan of beams, the occasional crack of cooling wood, the soft shuffle of feet on packed earth. A boy brought in a deer hide, still damp, still heavy. Dot, his father took it without a word and began scraping it clean with a curved blade. The scent was strong, musky, raw but not unpleasant. It was the smell of work, of use. Dot, as the hair was pulled away, the skin began to reveal its smoother underside, pale, strong, full of potential. Dot, the boy, sat beside him, watching. Would this be a cloak? He asked. Dot, his father shrugged. Could be. Could be bags. Could be shoes. The boy nodded, as if this made perfect sense. And it did, because nothing was made with just one purpose. Everything lived many lives. Nearby, a woman wrapped dyed yarn around a spindle. Reds from madder root, blues from woad, dull greens from nettles boiled in iron pots. She wasn't weaving yet, just preparing, making the colors ready for another day. Dot, her hands moved gently over the threads, arranging them into soft bundles, each one with its own quiet voice. A man rubbed a bit of beeswax into a cloak clasp. Its bronze dulled by use. Dot, it wasn't shining now, but it worked. It held the cloak. Closed, kept out the wind. That was enough. Dot, all around. The longhouse hummed, not with talk, but with the language of quiet care. Needle through cloth, blade on bone, thumb across thread, and in the stillness of it all, a kind of peace that only comes from small, slow work, done with love. Later, the children gathered the scraps, bits of bone too small to use, frayed bits of thread, tiny curls of wool. They made dolls out of them, little figures with heads too big, arms that flopped, and smiles etched with charcoal. One had a yarn hat that didn't quite fit. Another had no face at all, just a button sewn where the eye should be. Dot, no one corrected them. The dolls were perfect. Outside, the sun peeked through a break in the clouds. The world glowed slightly. But no one rushed out to greet it. There was still stitching to do. Still boots to patch. Still things to shape, repair, and repurpose. Clothes. And bones. Dot, not the glory of battle, not the fire of feasts. Just the texture of life, the fabric of staying warm. The carving of function into form. Dot, and in every stitch, a quiet kind of pride. Dot, winter comes softly. Snow does not fall fast. It arrives. The way silence does, slowly, gently, until everything is quiet. By the time the first snow arrived, no one was surprised. They'd felt it coming, not in the sky, but in their bones, a heaviness in the knees, a stiffness in the fingers, a silence in the woods where birds once called to one another. The air was no longer just cold. It was still. And then one morning, the world had changed. Not loudly. Not all at once. But the fields had become pale and flat. The hills were softened. The trees wore thin cloaks of frost. And the roofs of the longhouses, covered in thatch, now held a thin white cap like an old man sleeping in his chair. Inside the longhouse, people moved slower, not because they were tired, though they were. Not because there was less to do, though. There was, but because winter didn't ask for speed. It asked for patience. A woman stirred a pot of porridge that had been left to simmer overnight. It was thick, hearty. Steam rose from the surface and disappeared into the rafters. where the smoke liked to linger before slipping out through the chimney hole. Uh, Child rubbed her eyes and pulled a blanket tighter around her shoulders. She didn't want to get up just yet. No one pushed her. Mornings in winter didn't require much. The animals had already been brought close to the house. The goats huddled in a shed nearby. The chickens clucked softly, confused by the dark mornings. The dog slept curled near the fire, lifting one ear every now and then as if to listen to the snow. Someone shoveled the path outside. Not in a rush. Just a slow clearing. A small trail from the door to the well. The snow was light, powdery. It didn't fight back. Each step made that soft crunch, the kind that lingers in your ears. Long after you've stopped walking inside, people mended. They carved. They organized things that didn't need organizing. They moved things from one place to another and then put them back again. Time passed like syrup, slow, sticky, with no clear urgency. A boy tried to catch snowflakes in a bowl. When they melted, he simply shrugged and tried again. Meals were simple. And warm grains cooked for hours. Flatbread baked against hot stones. Bits of dried fish softened in broth. No one expected anything new, and no one minded. There was more sleeping now. More lying still with eyes open. More dreaming in the middle of the day. The dark came early. By mid-afternoon. The light outside faded into blue, then gray, then nothing. Someone lit a tallow candle and set it on a wooden shelf. Its glow was small, but steady. Enough to see the shapes of familiar faces. Enough to feel less alone. Children played quiet games, lining up stones, sorting bits of wool, inventing rules no one remembered the next day. A girl draped a doll in a cloak made from an old mitten. A boy tried to stack bits of firewood into a tower, then knocked them over with a smile he didn't explain. Their laughter was muffled by thick walls and thick air. Even sound seemed to move more slowly in winter. Outside. Icicles hung from the edge of the roof like teeth. Birds stopped visiting the windows. The lake, far beyond the ridge, had begun to freeze in slow circles, clear. Near the edges, cloudy in the middle, and the forest had gone very quiet. Even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, not to talk, but to listen, to the wood as it shifted in the heat, to the snow slipping from the roof in a soft thump, to each other's breathing. Someone carved a tiny animal from a bit of bone. Someone else twisted thread around her fingers, starting a new spool she wouldn't finish before spring. They didn't talk about when winter would end. They didn't count the days. They watched the smoke. They shared blankets. They slept. One night, as the wind pressed gently against the walls, a man whispered something to his wife. Not loudly, not clearly, just a few words. She smiled, but didn't answer. She pulled the blanket higher and rested her hand on his. They didn't speak again. Winter didn't frighten them. It didn't challenge them. It simply arrived, slowly, softly. They let it stay, because there was nowhere to go, and because life, even in stillness, was enough. Waiting for spring. When you can't rush the world, you learn to listen to it instead. The snow didn't melt all at once. That would have been too sudden, too loud. Instead, it softened. Each day. A little more slipped away quietly, like a guest leaving early from a long, slow gathering. A drip here, a slush underfoot, a dark patch of ground showing through where only white had been. Still, it was winter. But not quite, and the villagers, they noticed. Not with tears or fanfare, but with the slight tilt of a head at the smell of damp earth, or the way a crow's call echoed a little differently in the morning air. Inside the longhouse, things stirred gently. The air was still cool, still heavy with smoke and wool and quiet breath. But something was shifting. People began checking their tools, sharpening the spades, touching the handles of hoes and rakes and scythes, tracing their fingers along the smooth wood like they were waking up old friends. No one said, "Spring is coming." They simply acted as if it might be. Just in case. A woman sorted through baskets of seeds, little cloth bundles tied with bits of string, each labeled in the simplest way. A mark, a symbol, a color, She didn't plant anything yet, just looked. Held each bundle in her hand. Closed her eyes and imagined the rose. The growth, the slow rising of life from soil. It helped her heart beat differently. A boy poked the muddy snow with a stick. Every time he saw a sprig of green, he announced it softly, like he was telling the earth a secret. Leaf, he whispered. Grass. Moss. No one corrected him. He was right after all. Those things were there, just small, just early, but they were coming back. Tools were taken down from hooks, inspected, and set aside again. Not used yet, not needed. Just noticed. Iron rubbed with oil. Wood checked for cracks. Edges sharpened with gentle strokes. There was no hurry. The soil was still hard beneath. The frost. But it helped to be ready. People talked about the sun a little more. Not long conversations. Just soft remarks passed like folded cloth. Stays up longer now, someone would say. Or the mornings are louder. Or simply the sky's less gray today. And the others would nod and smile. And keep stirring the pot or brushing out the wool. They opened the door more often. Just to stand in the doorway. For a moment, to feel the wind on their cheeks. To hear the creak of wet trees or the flutter of a bird they hadn't heard in months. There was a lot of looking. This time of year, looking out the window. Looking at the sky. Looking at the ground to see if it had changed overnight. Sometimes it had. Usually it hadn't. But still, they looked. Someone repaired a basket. Another started patching a fishing net. Someone else made a list scratched into a piece of bark. With a bit of charcoal, not a list of things to do. Just a list of things to remember. Turn the soil near the rocks. Check the fence behind the shed. Tell Ingrid not to plant too early. Simple things. But important. In their own quiet way. The children ran outside. And came back in with muddy boots. No one scolded them. Spring came with mess. That was part of it. Puddles where snow used to be. Slush soaking through wool socks. Red hands. Pink noses. Faces turned toward the light. In the evenings. People still gathered by the fire, still carved, still mended, still told stories half remembered from their grandparents. But now, the stories sometimes ended with beginnings. The first time I planted carrots, the year the rains came late. That one spring when the sheep got out, and everyone would nod again, as if the memories themselves smelled faintly of warm soil, and greening hills. Sleep came more easily now. Not because of weirdness, but because the body recognized the promise of change. The dreams became lighter, longer, full of imagined harvests, warm sun, the soft breath of a calf just born. A girl placed a small rock on the windowsill. It wasn't special, just smooth. She liked how the sun warmed it, and that was enough reason to keep it there. Spring would come. Not quickly, but steadily, like everything else in their world. And until then, they would wait, sharpening tools, counting drips from the thatch, letting the light wake them slowly, and the thaw carry them forward, one quiet, muddy step at a time. Family ties and quiet love. Love didn't shout in the longhouse. It stirred the stew, mended the socks, and listened without needing to speak. The days had grown noticeably longer now. The corners of the longhouse no longer held quite so much shadow. Evening still came early, but with a different kind of hush, a hush not of cold, but of contentment. People smiled a little more, though not in any grand way. Just soft, knowing smiles that flickered between chores. The kind you share with someone when you've lived a long time beside them. In one corner, an old man sat with his daughter's child in his lap. The child wasn't doing anything in particular, just chewing absently on a piece of dried apple and watching the fire dance. The old man's hands rested on the child's tiny feet, warming them gently. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. He'd held his daughter like this once, many winters ago. And now he held her child. It was the same love, just passed forward. Nearby, a young couple repaired a cradle. It wasn't broken, but the wood had splintered slightly at the edge, and the mother kept smoothing her thumb across the rough spot whenever she walked by. so they worked together. Dot, he sanded while she wiped away the dust. Then she brought a cloth, dipped in warm oil, and rubbed it into the wood. They didn't talk much. Now and then, one of them hummed. A simple tune, without words. The kind of tune passed down not through songbooks, but through habit. Dot and the cradle began to glow again, the way wood glows when it feels cared for. A grandmother pulled a few herbs from a dried bundle, hanging above her bed. She crushed them in a wooden bowl and mixed them with honey and hot water. Dot, her grandson, had a cough. Not a terrible one. Just the kind that comes when the snow melts and the winds shift. She held the cup to his lips, gently blowing across the surface so it wouldn't scald him. There, she said. That's better. He didn't respond, just leaned against her and drank. A wife helped her husband tie the leather thong around his boots. He could do it himself. He always had, but this morning, his hands were stiff, and she noticed Dot, so she knelt down and worked the knots with practiced fingers. She even tugged the laces a little tighter than usual, so he wouldn't feel the looseness later. He touched her hair lightly as she stood. "Thank you," he said. She smiled, but didn't answer. He already knew Dot, 2 boys, no older than 7. Spent the afternoon building something from twigs. It wasn't clear what it was. A troughs, a top, perhaps, but they shared it. Took turns. Tossed stones and sticks without fighting, which was rare for them. Their mother watched from the doorway, her arms crossed loosely. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer help. She simply watched. Her face relaxed in a way it hadn't been all. Winter. Dot, at supper that evening, they all sat together on the long benches. Dot, it wasn't a feast, just the usual. Thick porridge, dried onions, bread spread with lard. Dot, but as the children chewed, one began to hum again. Another picked up a wooden spoon and tapped it gently on his bowl in rhythm. Dot, no one told him to stop. The beat was soft, steady, like a heart, echoing around the room. Later, when the candles had burned low and the fire was just embers, the longhouse began to shift into sleep, but not before the father tucked his youngest daughter beneath a fur, brushing her curls back from her brow. She was already half asleep, her breath slow and deep. "Tell me a story," she murmured. Dot, he leaned close. "You're already in one," he whispered. "This is the story. Us. Right here." She didn't answer. Her breathing stayed even. She had drifted Dot across the room. A woman gently adjusted the blanket over her husband's shoulder. He'd fallen asleep upright. Again, head tilted back, mouth open slightly. She didn't laugh, didn't wake him, just reached across and closed his cloak a little tighter around his chest. Dot, her fingers lingered on the fabric. Dot, then she sat down beside him, close enough that their knees touched. And she closed her eyes too. These were the family. Ties that held the village together. Dot, not rope. Not blood, even, but habit, attention, presence. A quiet hand brushing crumbs from a lap. A shared glance after a long day. A whispered word at the edge of sleep. There were arguments, of course. Frustrations. The usual bumps and bruises of people living closely. But even the quarrels had softened over time. No one yelled. They simply fell quiet, worked alone for a while, and came back together like stones settling into place. Outside, the snow had nearly melted. Small pools formed in the low ground, catching the reflection of the first new stars. Air smelled different now, like soil beginning to breathe again. And inside, among the drifting firelight and low murmurs of sleep, love settled quietly across the longhouse, like the last woolen blanket of the night. Dot, another year turns. The world spins gently, and life moves with it, not in leaps, but in circles. Spring didn't burst in like a song. It arrived like a sigh, long and quiet. You could feel it before you saw it, in the softness of the wind, in the smell of damp earth returning to itself, in the way the birds paused their calls, as if remembering how to sing. The villagers didn't make a celebration of it. Not at first. Dot, there were no great banners, no sun dances. Just the slow realization that one season had turned into another, and life kept going. When most people imagine Vikings, they think of clashing swords, crashing waves, and the roar of battle. But those moments, loud and fleeting, were rare. The real story, the soft, slow story was told in the quiet moments in between, the stillness after storms, the long repetitive days where nothing remarkable happened, the warmth of slow meals, the patience of mending cloaks, the comfort of hearing the same stories again and again. This is that story, not the story of a Viking raid, but the story of the year after it. The year when they simply lived, the quiet after the storm. We begin as the raiding party returns, not with noise, but with silence. The fjords echo not with shouts, but with the creaking of ships nudging gently against the dock. Salt still crusts the beards of the men, but their minds are already turning homeward. There is no glory, now only tired backs unloading sacks of grain and bundles of furs. The longhouse waits, warm and dark. Children peer from the doorway. A wife meets her husband's eyes, and he smiles without words. It's not reunion, a celebration. It's reunion as re-entry. The ship gets scrubbed. Nets get mended. Boots are set aside to dry. The fire is stoked. Life resumes. Mornings in the longhouse morning is not sudden. It begins with the soft crackle of embers, the groan of wood expanding in the changing air. A mother stirs the coals, adding dried twigs to the hearth, coaxing warmth from the ashes. A smell of barley porridge curls upward. People begin to move, slowly stretching, murmuring greetings, pulling wool cloaks tighter as they shuffle into morning light. Under one roof, the family stirs. Children yawn. Someone begins to slice a root vegetable. A sheep bleats outside, and someone mutters, "I'll get it." This is not action. It's rhythm. Chores flow like breath, predictable, necessary, shared. The farmer's rhythm out in the field. Time moves differently. The soil is cold at first, sticky, then forgiving. A man sinks his hoe into the ground and hears the same sound he's heard every season since he was a boy. The fields don't demand much, just patience. He talks to the oxen under his breath, not because they understand, but because someone should be listening. Crows cry out from far off. The sky is gray, then blue, then gray again. There are no surprises here, just weather. Just the small satisfaction of one row, then another. Weaving time in the women's corner of the longhouse. The loom stands tall and patient. Thread after thread is pulled, wrapped, passed through. Fingers move with a rhythm older than memory. Conversation drifts like smoke. Soft laughter, old stories, gossip without heat. The cloth grows slowly lines of earth tones. Soft red, muted blue. This is not work that needs attention. It needs presence. The women don't speak much when they're deep in it. Just hum softly, the loom creaking in reply. Time passes, and the fabric grows. The fisherman's hours dawn. Over the lake is quiet. Not even the birds sing yet. A fisherman slides his boat out, oar slipping into water with barely a ripple. Fog hangs low over the surface, and the world feels smaller here, tucked under sky and mist. He waits, breath visible, listening for fish, or maybe just for himself. Hours pass like this. Stillness. Then a twitch in the line. By dusk, he returns, hands raw. A few fish flapping in the net. He cleans them slowly, humming, lays them in salt to keep. The village echoes laughter. Echoes through the lanes as children play. Their games are simple, chasing each other with sticks, skipping stones, hiding in hay. They argue and make up within moments. An elder watches from a bench, retelling a tale everyone already knows, but the telling is part of the tradition. Far off, an axe chops wood in steady rhythm. A bird calls from the trees. The wind carries all of it, the voices, the sounds, the sigh of the longhouse door swinging shut. Market days, but not really. Once every few weeks. Someone walks to the market in the next village. It's not far, but it takes all morning. The path is muddy. The trees are familiar. You nod to people coming the other way or not. At the market, you swap a bolt of wool for a smoked fish. You look at a carved comb. You compliment someone's cow. No one rushes. No one haggles too hard. The biggest news is usually about the weather. You return before sundown, feet sore, pouch slightly lighter. and heart oddly full, law and order, slowly. At the thing, the village law gathering people gather in a loose circle. A dispute about a boundary stone. A missing goat, whose turn it is to maintain the fence along the river. Voices rise, but never shout. It might take all day. Sometimes two. No one is in a hurry. Justice here is not fast. It is careful. Decisions are made with repetition. Everyone gets to speak and usually says the same thing 3 times. Someone finally nods. Agreement. And then it's over. The goat is returned. The fence will be fixed. The law remains intact. Rainy days and muddy boots some days. It just rains. Not a storm. Just the kind of rain that starts at breakfast and never really stops. The longhouse darkens. Chores slow down. No one goes out unless they must. Boots are left by the door, dripping. People sit and mend. They sharpen things that don't need sharpening. Hey. Few gather near the fire. Someone starts a story. Someone else finishes it before they're done. You stare at the beams overhead. You listen to the drip. You remember nothing about the day. And that's all right. Long nights by the fire at night. The fire becomes the sun. Everyone gathers close. Shadows flicker across faces. A pot of broth steams gently. An elder begins a tale. Not with flair, but with softness. Something about a distant ancestor. A journey. A stone. Children listen, but also play with a scrap of leather or fall asleep halfway through. Someone carves a spoon. Another hums quietly. The fire crackles, and time bends. No one notices when the story ends. They just drift off, one by one, into dreams. Simple feasts. A feast in the village is not what you think. There's bread dents, and warm cheese, broth, maybe dried fish. And once in a while, meat. People sit close, sharing bowls and passing bread without asking. The mead flows slowly. 1 cup. Maybe 2. Stories get told. Not new ones. Just the ones that belong to feast nights. You laugh softly. You lean against your sister's shoulder. You eat until you're warm. Not full. That's enough. Clothes and bones clothes need patching. Shoes need stitching. Leather is softened with care. Bone tools are sanded smooth. Wooden bowls are oiled, then placed gently. On shelves. Nothing here is fast. Everything has been touched 100 times. Every stitch tells you who made it, and when, and what they were humming that day. Even a comb holds memory in its teeth. Winter comes softly, snow doesn't fall. It settles. The world grows quiet again. Steps are muffled. Doors stay shut longer. Chores shrink to what can be done inside. People sleep more, eat more, wait more. The woodpile gets smaller. The fire glows brighter. The stew thickens with root vegetables. Outside, the world sleeps. Inside, people dream, waiting for spring melting. Doesn't happen all at once. Drips from the thatch. Footprints in softening snow. A glimpse of brown earth beneath white. People sharpen tools, not because they need them today, but because they will need them soon. A child whispers leaf when he sees the first bud. A woman hums while sorting seeds. Someone counts the geese. Overhead, the world has not changed, but it's beginning to, and that's enough. Family ties and quiet love. In the longhouse is not spoken loudly. It's in the cup of warm water brought without asking. In the mended sock. In the way someone tucks the blanket tighter around your shoulder at night. Children learn by watching. Parents teach by doing. You sit beside someone, not to say anything, but simply to be with them. Love doesn't shout here. It simply stays. Another year turns, and then the year begins again. Soil is turned. Tools are used. Fires are smaller. Days are longer. Another set of footsteps follows the ones before. A child takes her first steps, while someone tells a story. Someone plants the same. Grow his father once did. Nothing has changed, and everything has. The soil had finally softened enough to press your fingers into. One morning, a farmer walked to the edge of the field with no particular urgency. He knelt down, scooped up a handful of dirt, let it fall slowly through his fingers, and he nodded to himself, and returned to the longhouse for his tools. That was how it began. The sheep were sheared again. The fences repaired. Dot people carried baskets out into the light, blinking at the brightness, still wrapped in cloaks from the winter that had just passed. Someone laughed, not a loud laugh, but one of those gentle ones that comes from the chest, almost surprised to be there. Dot it had been a long year. And somehow, also a short one. Children ran through puddles. Mothers hung damp linens in the breeze. Grandfathers sat in the sun, blinking slowly, nodding off between thoughts. The same things they'd done the year before. And the year before that, and the one before that too. No one kept track of time and days. They kept it in motions. The first turn of the soil. The first cup of meat outside instead of in. The first morning someone said, "I think it's warm enough to go barefoot again." Time wasn't something to race. It was something to live alongside Dot the longhouse breathed. Differently now. The doors stayed open longer. The nights were cooler, softer. The fire burned lower, more out of habit than necessity. Someone carved a new spoon. Someone mended an apron. Someone else sat with a basket of early herbs and picked through them, one by one, not in any hurry. There had been births and deaths over the past seasons, though not many of either. A baby was now crawling where she had once only cried. An old woman's chair now sat empty, but still warm, as if she might return to it soon. Someone had taken up her place at the loom, not to replace her, but to carry on her quiet work. Dot, and now here they all were. Dot the fields ready. The tools prepared. The heart steady, if a little tired. Dot another year beginning. Not like a new story, but like the next line in a very old song. Evening still ended with soup and flatbread. And the low hum of voices just before sleep. One man sharpened his scythe. In the twilight, stopping every few minutes to watch the sky shift from gold to purple to blue. He wasn't thinking of anything. Really. Dot just letting the year begin around him. The way you let your eyes close at the end of a long day. Inside, someone tucked the children in again. A girl whispered a question, but her voice faded before the answer came. Outside, a breeze rustled through the grass that had only just returned to green. The stars came back one by one, and somewhere in the quiet between footsteps and story time, the next year began, just like the last. But also, not. Dot, this is how Viking life truly moved. Not with raids or fire or battles carved into stone, but with chores passed down from hand to hand, with seeds sown from the same pouch into the same soil, with the patient turning of seasons again and again and again. Nothing happened. And that was the beauty of it. A year of mending, of listening, of waiting, of feeding chickens, of stirring soup, of sleeping near the fire while someone carved another spoon.